meeting. And the contract is in an amount not to exceed $10.3 million. The services under the contract are to provide COVID-19 positive case response and immunization support services for students attending DC public charter schools. The contract was formally submitted to the council on June 30th, 2023, 11 months after the execution of the underlying letter contract. To date, the committee has seen finger pointing to explain the delay. This roundtable will attempt to identify the real responsibility for the 11-month delay of a 12-month contract. The record for this roundtable will close in 2 weeks. That is at 5 p.m. on Thursday, August 17, 2023. And this roundtable is limited to testimony only from specified witnesses. And we have at the table Nancy Haven, who's interim chief procurement officer with the Office of Contracting and Procurement. Tommy Wells, who's director of the Office of Policy and Legislative Affairs. Seth Rosenthal, who's the chief deputy attorney general in the Office of the Attorney General. And Christina Grant, who is superintendent of the Office of State Superintendent for Education. I'll just say just a little bit more. The law has required for some time, it's in the Home Rule Act, so this is actually a congressional enactment, that contracts over $1 million in value or multi-year contracts have to be submitted to the council for approval. With regard to contracts over $1 million, unless they're multi-year, if they are submitted on time, then they are available for passive review and approval by the council, which is to say a contract for, let's say, a period to begin August 1st is given to us in June, and it's submitted to us for a 10-day review. And unless a council member introduces a resolution to approve or disapprove the contract is approved after 10 days. Pretty simple. However, when we receive a contract for a period that's already begun, then it has to be actively approved by the council, which of course is more work for everybody. The contract ends up being the same, whether it's given to us ahead of time or after the fact, but the process is much more complicated. In this case, the contract was submitted to us 11 months after it started, and that has raised some questions. And I have to say, I was not happy with responses that I received to written questions, and so we're having this roundtable. My understanding is that of the 4 folks at the table, only Dr. Grant has a written statement.
We submitted, I think we submitted a written statement from the Office of
I have
Attorney
a
General.
letter from the Attorney General.
Yeah, we submitted a letter last week, but I think we should have submitted some. You have not received it yet?
I don't know, but are you going to read this statement?
I will read a statement, yes.
Okay, excellent. Why don't we hear from Dr. Grant first? Ms. Hateman, I believe you don't have a statement?
I do not.
Okay. And Mr. Wells doesn't have either. I think he's just here for questions.
Dr. Grant is testifying on behalf of the executive. I'm here as a courtesy of the council at your request.
Thank you. Dr. Grant.
Good morning, Chairman Mendelson. I'm Dr. Christina Grant, and I'm the State Superintendent of Education for the District of Columbia. On behalf of the executive branch, I welcome the opportunity to provide information regarding the Office of the State Superintendent of Education's contract with Maxim Healthcare Staffing Services for COVID-19 positive case response and immunization support services. OSSE, with the support of DC Health and our local education agency and school partners, worked diligently to provide resources and guidance to enable schools to fully safely reopen for in-person learning and to stay open. Our schools were among the first in the area to reopen, and we're proud that we were able to stay open to in-person learning and keep students and staff safe through multiple variant surges. In the summer of 2022, the public health emergency and related response recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic were rapidly evolving. Most experts predicted that another COVID-19 variant was unlikely, but best cases would persist. As a result, OSSE, the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education, the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, and DC Health developed a plan to safely reduce and streamline school-based COVID-19 interventions for the 2022-23 school year. As outlined in our testimony to Council on June 29, 2022, this plan included providing direct clinical supports to LEAs through the provision of personnel called patient care technicians, or PCTs. PCTs provided school support with health-related priorities while reducing the burden placed on school administrators and staff to assume critical health and safety responsibilities. The PCT program required various levels of input and approval and was informed by updated school guidance from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention prior to OSSE moving forward with procurement. On July 19th, 2022, OSSE submitted the procurement package worth $13.3 million to the Office of Contracting and Procurement, OCP, to secure PCT supports from Maxim Healthcare Staffing Services. The agreement enabled OSSE to place a PCT in every charter school in the city and ensure parity between the district's education sectors. As the agency responsible for procuring this contract, our role was to establish the purpose for the procurement and submit the necessary documentation to OCP, which occurred last summer. To further explain the approval steps for this contract, OCP provided me with the following timeline of events. On July 19th, 2022, OSSE submitted a procurement package to OCP to procure COVID-19 and immunization support from Maxim Healthcare Staffing Services. A certificate of funding from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer was provided, certifying that sufficient funds were available for this purchase. OCP immediately requested compliance documents from the proposed contractor with a due date of July 20th, 2022. On July 22nd, 2022, the contractor requested an extension to submit the compliance document, and OCP extended the due date to July 25th, 2022. On July 25th, 2022, the contractor submitted the requisite compliance documents to OCP though the certificate of insurance was missing, requiring coverages. On July 27, 2022, the Office of Human Rights approved the contractor's equal employment opportunity compliance documentation, and OCP received a compliance certificate of insurance effective until November 30th, 2022. On July 29, 2022, the Department of Employment Services approved the contractor's first source agreement. On August 2nd, OCP found the proposed contractor responsible and clean hands compliant, determined the price fair and reasonable, and executed the contract. On August 4th, 2022, the contract was modified to the correct period of performance. On September 8th, 2022, OCP, during preparation of the council package, notified the contractor that it was now out of compliance with the district's clean hands requirements. On September 13th, 2022, the contract was modified a second time to decrease the estimated hours of service and change the contract administrator. On September 14th, 2022, the contractor became compliant with clean hands again. On December 8th, 2022, the contractor became non-compliant with clean hands requirement again. On December 13th, 2022, the contractor became compliant with clean hands requirement again, and OCP provided them with the necessary clean hands certificate. On July 9th, 2023, OCP requested an updated certificate of insurance and a revised small business enterprises subcontracting plan from the contractor with the due date of January 11th, 2023. On January 11th, 2023, the contractor submitted a revised compliant small business enterprising subcontracting plan to OCP. On February 8th, 2023, the subcontractor submitted a revised certificate of insurance to OCP that met all insurance requirements. On March 15th of 2023, OCP submitted the contract to the Office of the Attorney General for legal sufficiency. On April 24th, 2023, OCP received the legal sufficiency memorandum and submitted the council package to the Office of Policy and Legislative Affairs for review and transmittal to council. OPLA then requested council to agendize this contract before council's summer recess. To safeguard contracts from procurement fraud, waste, and to ensure contracts are appropriately and faithfully executed, there are many steps in the contract approval process, including council's review and approval for contracts exceeding $1 million. As a result, contracts often take months to gain approval. In this case, the vendor hit upon multiple common hiccups, namely clean hand certification and certificate of insurance issues, which prolonged the standard approval process. OSSE fully understands the serious nature of retroactive contracts and respects council's role in approving contracts over $1 million. OSSE will continue to coordinate closely and early as possible with OCP to prevent a need for retroactive contracts. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on Bill 25-400. I urge council to support this emergency bill approving expenditures incurred by the district to provide needed healthcare supports to schools to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. We welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. Mr. Rosenthal, you have a statement?
Yes, thank you, Chairman.
And I don't think we have a copy of it. You need to hit the mic and it will be red if it's on. And actually, Ms. Haitman, you should, and Ms. Dr. Grant, you should turn yours off. I don't know why, but red is go. So.
Okay. Good morning, Chairman Mendelson and council staff. My name is Seth Rosenthal. I serve as Chief Deputy Attorney General at the Office of Attorney General for the District of Columbia. I'm pleased to appear this morning on behalf of OAG to discuss the timing of OAG's review of contract number CW 101161 with Maxim Healthcare Staffing Services. Before turning to the timeline of OAG's review of this particular contract, I'd like to take a moment to briefly explain OAG's role in reviewing contracts for legal sufficiency. Under the DC Code, as you mentioned earlier, Chairman Mendelson, agencies must submit all contracts in excess of $1 million and all multi-year contracts to the council for approval. When agencies submit contracts to the council for approval, they must provide certain specified materials, including, quote, a certification that the proposed contract is legally sufficient, end quote. OAG provides legal sufficiency certifications for contracts for the following. 1, all agencies under the purview of the Office of Contracting and Procurement. 2, DC Public Schools. 3, the Child and Family Services Agency. And 4, the Department of General Services. Even for these agencies, OAG does not review the legal sufficiency of all contracts that the agencies execute. Rather, OAG only reviews the legal sufficiency of contract packages that the agencies prepare for submission to the council for council approval. And in the case of DGS, OAG only reviews contract packages that require active council approval rather than simply passive council approval. Turning now to OAG's involvement in reviewing contract number CW 101161 with Maxim Healthcare Staffing Services. The rules of professional conduct, including those relating to confidentiality and attorney-client privilege, constrain the information that our office can provide about the communications that our office has had with OCP and with the Office of State Superintendent of Education about this contract. We are, however, able to share that OCP sent the contract package to us at OAG for legal sufficiency review on March 15th, 2023, as Dr. Grant mentioned. OAG's legal counsel division then approved the legal sufficiency of the legislation included in the contract package on March 29th, 2023. Separately, in reviewing the contract package, OAG's government contracts section and OCP communicated about the contract on March 20th, March 21st, March 23rd, April 3rd, and April 21st, 2023. Our government contract section ultimately approved the contract itself and the contract package for legal sufficiency on April 21st, 2023, and the legal sufficiency certifications were sent to OCP on April 22nd, 2023. Once again, our office's communications about the contract with OCP and OSSE are privileged and confidential. So I'm only able to share limited information about our involvement in reviewing this particular contract for legal sufficiency. If you have any questions about the timing of our review, however, I'm happy to try to answer them without revealing privileged or confidential information that we're constrained from providing under the rules of professional conduct. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, you are the only two who have a statement, I believe. So I do have questions, and maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Rosenthal. So I was a little bit confused why OAG approved everything on March 29th and then didn't send a memo or legal sufficiency memo until April 21st. But looking at your statement more carefully, you approved the legislation on March 29th. And so the contract itself didn't have legal sufficiency until several weeks later.
That's correct. There are two different legal sufficiency reviews when contract is submitted for legislative approval. Our legal counsel division looks at the legislation, not the underlying contract package, but just the legislation itself to make sure that the form of the legislation is appropriate, to make sure that there are no technical errors in the legislation. For instance, that the contract number in the legislation is in fact the number of the contracted issue. And if it's legislation that requires retroactive approval, to make sure that the appropriate language authorizing retroactive approval is included in the draft legislation. So that's what our legal counsel division does. And that's the legal sufficiency certificate that they gave on March 29th. Separate and apart from reviewing the legislation itself, our government contracts section reviews the contract package, the underlying contract, for compliance with district contracting and procurement law and regulation. That's the review that stretched between when the contract package was initially submitted to us on March 15th and the review that the government contract section of our office ultimately gave on April 21st. So there are two different legal sufficiency certificates.
And that's helpful to know. As far as you know, did the government contract section get the document, the contract on March 15th?
Yes, we got the contract package on March 15th and had a series of communications, as I indicated in my
Yeah.
testimony, with OCP regarding the contract package between March 15th and April 21st.
So your testimony is that OAG moved as quickly as it could on this.
We believe we did.
Well, I want to ask if you have enough folks in the contract section, but before you answer that, I have a letter from the chancellor with regard to food service contracts that have not come to us yet. And in the letter, he says, and I think in fairness, I'll read most of the paragraph. DCPS determined the proposed awardees of this contract in alignment with procurement law and worked with the vendors to gather and submit required documents to OAG for their legal sufficiency review, the final required step before transmitting the contract package to the council for review. Contract packages are complex and require significant input from the proposed awardees after selections are made. DCPS submitted tentative council packages for review by OAG only 6 business days after scoring was completed. While it was our intent for this package to reach council prior to the July 3rd deadline, unfortunately, OAG was not able to complete its review and provide legal sufficiency in time for submission, given their volume of work. While OAG provided an initial review prior to the submission deadline, the OAG needed to prioritize contract packages citywide based on the needed contract award date. Because our needed contract award date was October 1st, and I will say parenthetically, it's actually this contract begins, I believe, August 1st. But again, what the chancellor wrote, because our needed contract award date was October 1st, review of these packages was deprioritized by OAG to support other more urgent procurements. DCPS was unable to respond to the OAG feedback, obtain additional documents from the vendors, and receive legal sufficiency and internal approval in the 3 business days between June 28th and the July 3rd council submission deadline. That answer from the chancellor seems to suggest that your contract section has got a whole lot of contracts in there, maybe even is overworked, which is why I asked you have enough staff.
Yeah, and look, our government contract section does work hard. They are given a lot of agency contracts to review. In an ideal world, would we have more government contracts attorneys reviewing agency contracts for legal sufficiency, given the volume of work? Yes, but we have budget constraints, as you know.
How many folks do you have in the contract section?
I do not have that information offhand, so I don't want to answer without having it, but I will get that information to you by the end of the day.
Making a note. All right, so you'll get back to us with the number. Okay, so with regard to the Maxim contract, that contract completed legal sufficiency August 24th. I'm looking at a different document now. So on or about August, not August, April 24th.
April 21st is when legal sufficiency of the contract, legal sufficiency review of the contract package was completed. And we
Yes.
transmitted the legal sufficiency certificate to OCP on on April 22nd.
Okay, and the chancellor in his letter that I just read says it characterizes that as the last step in the procurement process before it comes to the council. So, Mr. Wells, why do we get it June 30th when the last step to legal sufficiency comes to the government April 21st?
I defer to Dr. Grant on that.
It's our understanding that this package was sent over and we were awaiting it to be agendized after June 21st, sorry.
I'm not sure it's fair to be pointing the finger at you here. Do you handle the document, the contract?
I'm sorry, that's mischaracterization. I didn't point fingers that
Yeah.
Dr. Grant has the chronology and is prepared to answer the questions of the council. That is not pointing fingers, but Dr. Grant is testifying on behalf of the mayor.
Okay, so looking at her statement, on April 24th, OCP received the legal sufficiency memorandum and submitted the council package to the Office of Policy and Legislative Affairs for review and transmittal to the council. Dr. Grant, are you the one who submitted it to OPLA or did OCP submit it to OPLA?
That is a good question. It's my understanding that OCP submitted it to OPLA on April 24th, 2023.
Well, let me put it differently. Did you submit it to OPLA on April 24th? Dr. Grant, did you submit it?
No, OCP submits it to OPLA.
Okay. Is that correct, Ms. Hateman?
Actually, OCP enters it into a system called the IQ system, which includes OPLA as one of the recipients of the documents in IQ. And so
And that
yes,
happened on April 24th?
that happened on April 24th.
Okay. And you're the one who put it in IQ, not Dr. Grant.
An OCP person put it into IQ, yes.
Okay. So, Mr. Wells, the contract came to us June 30th. Why over 2
June
months?
30th being submitted, what, June 21st
No.
or June 22nd?
Well, I'm looking at the transmittal memo.
So
from
8
the-
days later is what
Notice-
you're saying.
From the secretary of the council. Notice is given that the attached proposed legislation was introduced in the office of the secretary on Friday, June 30th. Copies are available in room 10 of the Legislative Services Division. So that's June 30th when it was filed. On April 24th, OCP, not Dr. Grant or not OSSE, OCP submitted it to OPLA. Why over 2 months?
So being submitted to OPLA actually is not a great way to present it. It's more submitted to what's called the IQ process, where the contract and the process are reviewed by the city administrator and the mayor's council, and also, others along the way. What I don't know is if there were any infirmities that were picked up in that process. Being submitted to OPLA doesn't mean it sits on OPLA's desk. It goes through a process of review before it's deemed ready for the council. And in that process of review, that's how long it took. And I think Dr. Grant may have some information about that, or Ms. Hateman, about the process of that review and being sure that the package was prepared completely
Well,
for
Dr.
council.
Grant's-
Legal sufficiency is not the only thing in preparing for this.
Well, let me see. Dr. Grant's statement, because you keep turning to her, saying that she's testifying on behalf of the executive. I appreciate that. Her testimony ends on April 24th. So I'm not quite sure what she has to add. Ms. Hateman, can you add more to what EOM did after April 24th?
I can
You're
add,
not part of EOM. Are you part of EOM?
no, I'm part of OCP.
Okay.
Okay, so when it's entered into the IQ system, as Director Wells says, it's not only sent to OPA, but in the IQ, documents are sent to other officials in the EOM, such as the city administrator's office, the chief of staff, if there's a deputy mayor for the particular agency, the deputy mayor, and the mayor's general counsel. Those are the general recipients of things when they are entered into the IQ system. So as each office reviews those documents, they may have questions about the procurement or about the documents, in which case they would ask OCP and we would provide the information that they need.
And are you saying that there were lots of questions to OCP?
I'm not saying lots, but there were communications from different people in the review process along the way. So there were some questions on the documents.
Okay. Interesting. Questions like why this took so long for a contract that started 8 months earlier, 10 months earlier, or questions like why are we doing this since we've been doing this now for 8 months based on a contract that's a task order with an existing contract with the Department of Health for what, at least a couple of years?
The questions were more along the lines of this wording of the specific documents that were in the package submitted.
Okay. So is it typical, are those kinds of questions typical?
We do typically get some questions. Some packages get more than others.
Did this get more than others?
I think it got probably what I would call in the usual range of questions.
Usual range of questions. So is it the standard that the contracts that you send to the council, which you send through OPLA, take over 2 months with OPLA? Or through this IQ process?
I would say the time can vary a lot. Probably this one was a little bit different time frame than we would expect on some contracts, but anytime we have a package that's being submitted for retroactive approval, we do get more questions and we do have more time involved in the process, not just with OPLA, but with anyone along the way in the
Which kind
IQ
of reminds
process.
me, has the PARB looked at this?
Yes, the PARB did look at this.
And what did they say? Fine, great, wonderful?
Well, I would say the PARB never finds it wonderful when there is a retroactive contract. So that is certainly not the outcome of the PARB on this, but the PARB did look at that. The PARB understood the reasons why this became a retroactive package and accepted those reasons.
And when did the PARB look at this?
The meeting was in early July.
After the contract submission and after I objected to the contract?
The PARB was scheduled before that. The PARB was scheduled for several weeks before we actually had it.
Okay, so when was it scheduled?
I'm sorry,
When was it scheduled?
when was it actually, the date that it was
Sure.
held? It was early July. It might have been around July 12th.
And your testimony is that the scheduling of that PARB meeting on this contract was actually before it was filed with the council.
Correct. It was scheduled sometime in mid-June, but I don't have the exact date when it was
Okay.
scheduled.
But it is unusual that it would be 2 months, over 2 months. So
Well,
Mi-
for
Mr. Wells.
clarification, Mr. Chair, that this isn't a standard, it's not standard for contracts to be retroactive, as you know.
that's not correct.
And so it's a
We get an
retroactive
awful lot of
contract.
tipping contracts, Mr. Wells. And those are all
Maybe
retroactive.
tipping contracts, but to go into the PARB, as you know, that process is chaired by the mayor. The executive takes these contracts very seriously. And to have a contract that's retroactive to come to the council, the mayor wants to know why. And so there's a process that includes the city administrator, the chief of staff, myself, and the mayor to ask the contracting agency looking for the contract, why is this a retroactive
Yeah,
contract?
that's the PARB.
Yes.
Okay, but I'm talking about what happened between April 24th and June 30th. And we know the PARB didn't meet before June 30th. And in fact, what we've heard is that the PARB wasn't scheduled until mid-June, which I'm guessing is about 10 days
There are
before.
questions regarding the contract as Ms. Hateman said, that there are questions regarding the contract. Some contracts may have standard questions or common questions, but it doesn't mean that they're answered immediately. That you have to wait till you get the answers.
Help me here again, Ms. Hayden. This was a task order,
Correct.
meaning that it was added on to an existing contract Department of Health had.
There was an existing contract, correct.
So, and how long had that existing contract been around?
That existing contract was awarded during the COVID emergency. So I believe, I don't have the exact number, the exact date, but I believe it was in effect for maybe a couple of years.
Couple of years. I'll go with a couple of years because a couple of years would mean we've had a couple of years of experience with Maxim providing these services.
Correct.
And in fact, I'll ask you, but part of the contracting or procurement process is looking at whether the proposed vendor, what their record is, whether it has been satisfactory or not.
Correct.
So we had experience, a couple of years of experience, plus part of your standard process to look to see whether Maxim's services were satisfactory. So the only thing I'm getting that's extraordinary here is that this was retroactive by 8 months when it went to OPLA.
Well, the OPLA did not have this or in the IQ for 8 months. But as you stated, it had been 8 months before it got to OPLA. And one of those questions that would be asked through the IQ process, which is not uncommon for a contract that's been there for a while, is to get a clean hands documentation required by law and by the council. And so it is likely that the clean, and I will get confirmation, but the clean hands certification had lapsed, which is not uncommon for a current contract. And so they have to go back to the vendor to say, we need to have a clean hands certification, even though it's a contract you currently have. And so that would be the kind of thing picked up in the IQ process, because we know there has to be a clean hands document. And so in this case, they had to go back and get it. I don't know if y'all know the date when that was requested.
Not after April 24th. So it's submitted to IQ, which includes OPLA on April 24th. And the clean hands didn't need to be renewed after that. So that doesn't apply, sorry. But
Well, it's a
But tell
common,
me where it is, maybe this would be for Ms. Hateman. Where in the law does it say that the clean hand certificate needs to be updated? So if I remember from Dr. Grant's testimony, her chronology, the clean hand certificate had to be updated in July and again, I think in September, maybe I'm wrong, and then in December, and then again in February. Where does the law require that? Law, not regulation.
Well, when we submit packages to the council requirement is that the clean hands certification be current within 90 days of when the package is submitted. That has been the practice. I don't believe it's stated anywhere in the council rules either, but that has been the practice for many years, a requirement for submission.
Okay, I appreciate that interest in timeliness. Unfortunately, timeliness is what this hearing is all about. I don't believe that 90 days is a requirement in the law. And I'm not saying that it should be disregarded, but it strikes me, tell me if any of you disagree, strikes me as a little absurd that a contract with Maxim, who'd been doing services with the city for a couple of years prior to this contract, who gets an updated clean hands on July 5th, July 25th, has to then submit a clean hands and everything gets delayed, what, 3 more times for this?
Well, in addition to it being a requirement for council submission,
Wait a minute, requirement by
Oh.
whom?
by practice and procedure of the council,
I'm sorry, can you point to it in writing?
I can point to numerous times we've received emails in the past that the council, the clean hands was going to not be sufficient to cover the length of time the package would be at the council. And we did receive, this was several years ago, because this has been a practice for several years. And also now, when we initiate the package in the review process, if the clean hands is not current, it also will not receive legal sufficiency from OAG, and it will not get through the EOM approval process either.
So, all right, part of this hearing is to figure out where responsibilities are, and I can talk to our secretary's office about whether they reject contracts that don't have a clean hands within 90 days. But I'm still getting the sense that there's a sort of a bureaucratic red tape at work here, that everybody is enforcing a 90-day requirement when it doesn't exist in the law. And that might make sense if this is a brand new vendor or a brand new contract, but this was a task order on an existing contract for which there was a clean hand certificate for this contract, this task order on July 25th, I believe, and on that's July 25th and September 13th and December 8th and February 8th. I'm just saying, the same contractor, the same contract, and we do, how many, I just say 4 clean hands requirements.
I'm going to say that on this one, we probably didn't need to have all 4. We probably could have had fewer, but I don't think in the end it was just the clean hands that led to the processing time
Oh,
required.
sure, but I'm picking on the clean hands because I believe Mr. Wells said that clean hands was an issue in the 2 months that this was in IQ.
But I
And
would,
not only was clean hands not updated after April 24th. Well, it wasn't updated after April 24th. So I just don't see, we're going to go
That's
back
just,
to that. in 2
that's
months.
one of the things that comes up of what part of the IQ process is be sure everything's together.
Okay, so, but
it's-
maybe that's not relevant here.
Exactly.
Okay.
But in terms of the practice of trying to be sure that everything's together, it's like the contract approval, another month of not being approved to wait for the council to have this hearing. There's things that happen when there's a retroactive contract that brings up concerns to be able to determine, was it done correctly? Is it right? And
I don't
frankly,
think your answer is focusing on this contract and what happened here. So you just said clean hands was an issue, but I clarified that clean hands wasn't an issue. You also said the deputy mayor has to approve. Now, I believe this is an OSSE contract, so that would be the deputy mayor for education. DME. I don't see where DME did an approval.
Well, it's a part of the review process that Director Wells is speaking to.
Oh, but he said that there was the deputy mayor for the appropriate agency has to look at it and approve it.
Well, that was a part of my original testimony in terms of how we found the need to necessitate this contract.
I appreciate that, but I'm looking at something that didn't come from you.
Okay,
And it says received in OPLA April 24th, entered in IQ April 24th, approved by the Office of General Counsel on May 2nd, approved by the city administrator, Office of the City Administrator, on May 9th, sent to LP on May 9th. Who's LP?
the chief of staff, Ms. Parker.
And approved by the chief of staff on June 15th. So that's 5 weeks. Maybe that's where the delay is. Mr. Wells?
All I know is that there
What
is,
happened between? May-
there's a
everybody else had
process.
approved it.
I mean, big contract, it goes through an approval process. I mean,
Help me,
that
big
it may
contract?
seem frustratingly long, but this is a contract that's retroactive. And that was, there's a lot of questions to be sure that it's meets all DC laws, but
So
also the
does
process.
OPLA follow up on this? So, like,
OPLA
hey, we've had
submits
this, let me finish. So does OPLA follow up on these contracts? So you get the contract on April 24th. Is somebody like, we need to move this through the system? You know, actually, this contract expires on August 2nd, and here we are in May, and does OPLA say like, hey, well, actually, OGC approved it, it looks like 1 week after it went into IQ. And the Office of the City Administrator approved it roughly a week later. That's May 9th. So maybe that's not too untimely, but then it just sits with LP for 5 weeks. Does OPLA like say, hey, this contract needs to get to the council? We're going to have a hearing if this doesn't get to the council? Because the chairman's going to be pissed off because this is like 9 months, 11 months, how many months? 10 months into this contract? School year's over. Does OPLA follow up?
There's a presumption that the chief of staff, is executing their duties as they understand them best. And if they need extra time to be able to go back to check on things related to the contract, I can't speak for the chief of staff, but I can speak for the executive, office of the
But my question
process.
was to speak for you. Does OPLA follow up and make sure these things move along and don't get stalled? You know,
OPLA,
when a bill comes to me to sign, not to reveal any big secrets, when a bill comes to me to sign and I don't sign it, I get a note or a call from the secretary. Hey, this has been sitting in your office. Does OPLA do that?
Yes.
Did they do that here?
Generally, we take all the matters that are moving through the IQ, and we have provided, and I believe at that time we were still providing the dates of when things were submitted and how long they've been there to be sure that their attention is paid to it. But generally, everybody's executing their duties. OPLA, obviously does not have oversight of the chief of staff, but we do track, and we do, on behalf of the agencies, we do prod things along and try to be sure that we meet the council criteria for submission in order to get it on your agenda.
Well, what I'm hearing delicately put was that OPLA didn't push on this, so it languished for 5 weeks before it was finally approved. That's really what I'm.
Is OPLA's role to push on these things?
Well,
I do push on these, and on this contract, I'm not sure that we did or didn't. But is it OPLA's role to push city administrator or others? We track it. We have the process to get it through, but we don't generally second guess the chief of staff or the city administrator on what they need in order to approve something sufficient. We don't second guess them.
so it languished.
That's your
So
term,
then
Mr.
what-
Chair. That is not my term.
So
It was in the process.
what I hear is, I'm looking at Ms. Hateman's letter. I can't find the exact sentence here, but hey, we sent this over to OPLA on April 24th and
OPLA did what it's supposed to do. You see when OPLA
so it's
entered
not
it into the
supposed to
IQ
follow.
process. You see that OPLA did exactly what they're supposed to do. We entered it into the IQ process.
So is it acceptable? You're saying it's acceptable that a contract, it's not only at that point, 6
Well,
months, 7
what I'm
months
speaking
late?
to is I'm saying that OPLA executed its role exactly as it is supposed to. OPLA did not sit on anything. OPLA did not delay anything. You have me here because you believe that OPLA delayed something. We did not.
Because
it's
that's what
in your-
the agency tells us, Mr. Wells, is that we send it to
I
OPLA.
didn't hear that from the agency. OPLA
Let me
entered
see.
it into the IQ
contract was
process
signed-
as it's
Mr.
supposed
Wells,
to.
The contract was signed by the offeror contractor on or before August 2nd, 2022. It was countersigned by the contracting officer on or before August 2nd, 2022. The certificate of clean hands given to me is dated February 13th, 2023. The funding certification is dated February 17th, 2023. And the Attorney General's legal sufficiency certification is dated March 29th, 2023. So why did another 3 months pass before the contract is submitted to the council? Answer. Though the OAG's memo indicates legal sufficiency certification dated March 29th, the memo was not released by OAG until April 22nd. We've already clarified that. The package was submitted into the IQ system on April 24, 23, which initiates the OPLA review process. Quote, the package was submitted into the IQ system on April 24, 2023, which initiates the OPLA review process, unquote. And that was the answer to why did it take another 3 months before the contract was submitted to the council?
So what
Because it
you've
was
said is that,
initiated with OPLA on April 24th.
so the Office of Policy and Legislative Affairs did exactly what you said. We submitted it within 2 days of receipt. That is what the Office of Policy and Legislative Affairs, that's our role. That's what we do. Now, do we oversee the process of the city administrator? Their sufficiency process,
Wait a minute, the city
We don't do
administrator
that.
approved it in a week.
who did?
The city
Right,
administrator.
then it moves on to the others, but we don't, OPLA executed exactly as OPLA is supposed to. Now, what you're using OPLA in a generic way, you might as well say the executive office of the mayor's team took this long to get, confident that the contract was sufficient and that everything had been done. But to say that OPLA somehow did something.
Yeah, no, that is what I'm saying, because OPLA apparently did nothing between May 9th when it, according to this, sent it to LP, and June 15th when it was approved by LP. Ms. Haitman, has anything substantively changed about the contract since last fall?
No, there have been no changes to the contract since modification number 2 issued very early on in the process, which was
Okay.
within a short time after award.
So this, between April 24th and June 30th, with whatever's going on in the EOM, that OPLA is not honchoing, doesn't result in any change to the contract.
April 24th, OPLA put the contract into the system as they are supposed to. And then the other folks that then sign off on the contracts, they did what they needed to do to feel that it was, or believe, and to, say that they would sign off on it. But OPLA executed exactly as OPLA is supposed to.
So, Ms. Haitman, if on February 8th, the contractor submitted the revised certificate of insurance, and there was a current clean hands, why was it 5 weeks before OCP submitted the contract to the Attorney General?
Those 5 weeks were an internal OCP review.
Can you say more? Presumably, the
After-
contracting specialist or officer got everything right by August 2nd. On August 2nd, OCP found the proposed contractor responsible and clean hands compliant, determined the price fair and reasonable, and executed the contract. So what needs to happen between February 8th and March 15th?
We do have our own internal review chain, which is after a contracting officer does a contract, it goes to the chief contracting officer. And then after that, it goes to the deputy chief procurement officer, who looks at all the documents in the package to determine that the action is properly documented and justified, that the, for example, council summary is reflective of what it should be included. And then after that review is completed, it is approved to go to OAG.
So why didn't that happen in September? On September 13th, the contract was modified a second time to decrease the estimated hours of service and change the contract administrator on that September 13th. On September 14th, the contractor became compliant with clean hands again, and you had a current certificate of insurance. So why didn't that happen in September?
I think what you have here is really at this point, a balance of workload priorities by the contracting officer involved. When the contract, especially right before October 1, most contracting officers have numerous contracts that they have to get in effect by October 1. So there's always a balancing of, Yes, you have one package that is retroactive approval, but you also have others that are not yet. And how do they handle that to keep as many in the active status as possible?
Okay, so I think what you're saying in a delicate way is there's not enough staff and you have to prioritize, but in this case, the prioritizing meant that it was another 6 months.
Yes, and I agree that that is longer than we want. And actually what we've done in OCP is, in addition to reemphasizing to all contracting personnel that we actually don't want retroactive packages, but those do occur on occasion. When a contracting officer knows that there is a potential for a retroactive package, immediately the deputy CPO and myself need to be notified so that we can determine whether there are other alternatives that are appropriate. And if there is one that is going to go forward as a retroactive package, we've set a limit, a time limit for them to now provide the package to the deputy for review so that we don't have these ongoing situations where there's numerous amounts of days accounted for processing of the package. We understand that everybody has to prioritize the workload we have, but we're also trying to make sure that we don't have things that go on for a long time, because in this case, this has impacted the vendor significantly.
So what's going through my mind, this is kind of a weird question to ask, but isn't it a bit unfair to OSSE, the client agency, what's happened here? I mean, why does Dr. Grant have to be here defending this contract when it's not her fault that OCP could have done in September what it did in between February 8th and March 15th?
She did
That
not,
OPLA could have gotten this through quicker than it came through.
yeah, she did not control the timeline on the preparation of the package. So yes, it's unfortunate that she is a part of this discussion.
And hasn't there been a whole lot more work with this contract than otherwise would have been required if this had been, how do I put, formalized, packaged in August or maybe September?
Absolutely. I mean,
I'm
one of
sorry,
the.
just say that again.
Oh,
Absolutely.
absolutely. Yes, it's more work the longer it takes to get a package through completion. And this is really something I emphasize with the contracting officers many times, is that the retroactive packages really increase the workload for so many people. And that's why we are really focusing on tracking and processing the packages in as timely a fashion as possible, because it increases the workload for everyone.
Where is there in the law the requirement for a current insurance certificate?
Well, it's actually in the solicitation, there is a requirement that we have certain levels of insurance. We work with the Office of Risk Management on what those levels of insurance should be, and the contractor needs to provide that level of insurance. So I wouldn't call it a legal requirement in a law, but it is a requirement of the solicitation. Therefore, it becomes a requirement of the procurement that they have to
Well,
have
and
current insurance.
that's a legal requirement if it's in the
It is, but
procurement,
it's not in a stated
but it's
law.
not
But
our
it's,
requirement.
no, it's something we include in the solicitation, what level of insurance we want each contractor to provide.
And so why isn't it sufficient to get in this case, you got the certificate of insurance before you executed the contract on August 2nd or thereabouts? Why isn't that enough? Why does it need to be updated 2 more times?
Well, in this case, the insurance coverage is listed in the certificate of insurance actually expired on November 30th. So the coverage in the insurance often doesn't match the term of the contract because they may have already had this coverage. So we needed, once the coverages were expiring on November 30th, we did have to get an updated certificate of insurance to move, to protect the district, but also to make sure that we could get legal sufficiency.
Okay, so to get legal sufficiency, Mr. Rosenthal?
In terms of how long it would ordinarily take.
No, Ms. Haitman just said that they would have to update the certificate of insurance to get legal sufficiency from you. The insurance was a requirement of the procurement. It's not a requirement in the law. They had a certificate of insurance at the time that they executed the contract. So the fact that it would expire in November, is that relevant to you all and your legal sufficiency?
So let me be clear that I am not a government contracts expert and I do not have any experience in reviewing government contracts for legal sufficiency. But my understanding is that if the solicitation says that you need to have an up-to-date insurance certificate, then an up-to-date insurance certificate must be included in the contract package for our government contracts section to sign off on legal sufficiency. Because what's in the contract package has to be consistent with what was in the solicitation.
Okay. So, Ms. Haitman, what happens if we had gotten this contract in August and we had approved it? The certificate of insurance was going to expire in November.
Yes, the contracting officer has to track that when the contract is awarded and would have to obtain an updated certificate of insurance.
So that's a requirement regardless of the council approval.
Correct.
Give me just a second. Dr. Grant, I do have a question for you. Why did OSSE wait until the middle of July to ask for this?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Why did OSSE wait until the middle of July to ask for this?
The concept of the contract itself?
Yes.
Oh, okay, 1 second. The reason that we waited, I wouldn't say is the framing. I would say it took us time to be very clear about the way we wanted to start the school year. So if we go back to the year and think about, I would say we'd go back 2 years to think about all of the services that were in support in schools to reopen schools that first year coming out of COVID. We made sure that schools had appropriate nursing, PPE, et cetera, a whole host of things to navigate the first year of back to in-school learning. We wanted to work very closely, as I mentioned, with DC Health, Homeland Security, the Center for Disease Control, to be clear about what supports we wanted in place for school year 22-23. Those conversations took multiple months. There was, and Tia, correct me on this, but there was one issuance of school guidance in March of 2022 from the CDC that we worked to unpack and uncover and decide what we would want to be true in Washington, DC. There was a second issuance of guidance in June. That's what I'm looking at. There's a second issuance of guidance in June that we also took part in looking at and reviewing. And in that guidance, the CDC made certain recommendations. We had found ourselves in a position where we were no longer mandating certain things, but we wanted to ensure the confidence of our schools, our school leaders, our families around making sure that we continued to have, let me say that, a very comprehensive and robust approach in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the services that we had in place in our schools. We made a decision to make sure that PCTs would be in all of our schools, both DCPS and public charter schools. And that decision-making came together in June. We then worked with our OCP partners to prepare documentation, et cetera, and we delivered our package in July. And so that process, again, is directly connected to what I feel we've been navigating for the last 3 years, is a real desire to ensure that our schools are open and are safe, that we are continuing to give our school leaders and our teachers the appropriate amount of staff and supports that allow them to be focused on teaching and learning, and to allow health professionals to be focused on navigating the realities of a pandemic. That process and decision-making came forth in June, and we then moved forward with the process of building the contract.
So you couldn't, well, yeah, I think what I just heard you say is you started working on getting this contract in June and then got everything together to submit it to OCP July 19th.
That's correct.
Couldn't have done this any sooner?
I mean, we've been navigating COVID for 3 years now. And so the process of scaling up or having the ability to scale down supports in our schools. June is the end of a school year. And so every single month, in some respects, weeks, we'd be stepping back with our school communities. And our final decision to ensure we had PCTs in place was made in June. And then we worked to ensure that we were following our contracting procedures to put together the package. And I don't know if you're saying, like, could we have made that decision earlier? We were making lots of decisions in real time, and the timing of this decision was in June.
Ms. Haitman, you look like you want to say something?
No.
Okay. My understanding was that OSSE wanted this contract in place for this school year.
That is correct.
So why August 2nd? That's not this school year. School year is like 3 weeks later, maybe 2, depending, because it's charter schools.
Well, we have schools that, I'll say that. So our school year, in some respects, we're in it right now. Like our schools tend to close in June. We then immediately go through procedural processes to restart a school year. In our world, PCTs played, in this specific contract, PCTs played a significant role in operational processes and procedures that took place before the actual first day of school. So the contract starts in August because we have onboarding, training, et cetera. Fun fact, our school system opens in waves in Washington, DC, that start with some of our schools that are year round. We have a set of non-public schools. Then we have waves of charter schools that open. And then we have our largest LEA, which is DCPS, opens. And so these PCTs played a role in the support of our public charter schools opened, and that timing occurs through August.
Well, I'm looking at Ms. Haitman's response to my questions a month ago. My question was, why wasn't this contract submitted to the council before the start of its term, i.e. before August 2nd, 2022? Please note we are now 11 months into the term. Response, the council's summer recess ran from July 15th through September 15th, 2022. The Office of the State Superintendent of Education submitted a procurement request for Maxim's nursing services to the Office of Contracting and Procurement on July 19th, 2022. Although what you just said, Dr. Grant, suggests that there were conversations before July 19th, 2022. This didn't just suddenly plop on OCP's desk on July 19th. Correct?
I'm unclear of your question.
You were working with OCP before you submitted the documents on July 19th.
The plan with various levels of input on moving forward was informed by guidance that was released on June 13th. Health guidance around the operation of school. Using that guidance, we moved as quickly as possible to communicate this plan with our schools and to gather the needed documentation to submit a procurement package to OCP. It took us 1 month to get that package together. We notified OCP on June 19th that a contract was needed prior to the school year start in
On
August.
June 19th,
July 19th.
July 19th. Okay. Continuing to read from Ms. Hateman's letter. Requesting the contract's award before the first day of school, August 29th, 2023, to ensure these critical services were in place. The contract was awarded to Maxima on August 2nd, 2022. So that's what I'm getting at, is why so quickly August 2nd when you had until August 29th. Now that's her letter. Are you saying that actually you needed it in place before August 29th?
I'm unclear of your question. My apologies.
Ms. Hateman, do you understand what I'm asking?
I understand your question, and I think what Dr. Grant mentioned just a few minutes ago was there were various startup activities that needed to occur with the contract being awarded, but not yet providing the services. I believe there was some planning involved. There had to be getting the staff in place, getting the staff trained, and all of that had to occur before the actual start of the school year, but the contract had to be in place in order for those to occur.
You agree with what
That's
Ms.
correct.
Hateman just interpreted your?
Well, I mean, you're saying August 29th. And so that is correct, that we needed. I think what I am framing back is there's a general understanding that people say that August 29th is the first day of school, but this need was for charter schools and charter school. And so August 29th is a usually used date, but we needed the contract in place to ensure that the entire system was ready to reopen.
Ms. Hateman, when awarding under an emergency procurement, does OCP need a funding certification, clean hand certification, and a legal sufficiency from OAG before a contract can be awarded? Or are these documents only necessary for council contract package?
Funding certification is necessary for any procurement. So if the emergency procurement would need the funding certification. We do have rules that if it's a true emergency, let's say the pipe has burst in a building and we have to have someone come in right away, we can authorize a contractor to begin work, and within 3 business days, we get the paperwork together. But in essence, an emergency procurement does have to have the written documentation that goes with it. We do not, in this case, we did not get legal sufficiency before we awarded it. It was not necessary that we get legal sufficiency before we award it. The legal sufficiency requirement really comes in from the fact that it was going to the council, and a legal sufficiency certification is needed for contracts that don't go to council. Whether we get legal sufficiency is a determination we make on for a particular contract. It's not an across the board requirement.
So legal sufficiency is only necessary for council contract package.
Correct.
Clean hands is only necessary for?
It's necessary for any contract that we do, I believe above $100,000.
Regardless of whether it comes. to the
Regardless of whether it comes to the council or not.
And funding certification. is
Funding
required for all.
certifications for every contract.
So I have another question here, which I was going to ask Mr. Rosenthal. The no OAG review is done prior to execution of contracts. That's not, actually, I didn't read that very well. We kind of talked about that. You sort of spoke about that in your statement, Mr. Rosenthal. Is this good for the government that the Attorney General's office, your contract section, is not looking at contracts for legal sufficiency?
Well, we look at some contracts for legal sufficiency, those that come to the council. We don't look at all contracts for legal sufficiency. The statute that requires legal sufficiency review is not clear about which agency or entity of the district government, ought to be reviewing contracts for legal sufficiency. This is the practice that has kind of developed over time, is that, we at OAG review certain contracts for legal sufficiency. At the end of the day, it is the legislature's decision about whether OAG should be reviewing every contract for legal sufficiency. I'll only repeat what we said in a letter to you back in February, which is that if the council were to go in that direction, we would need a lot more lawyers than we currently have, because there are a lot of contracts that are issued by district agencies that OAG does not currently review. And to answer your earlier question, council member, about how many attorneys we have in our government contract section, I do have the answer to that. We have 14 attorneys in our government contract section. That includes a section chief, an assistant section chief, and 2 attorneys that are paid for and work exclusively for the Department of Transportation and do contract work for the Department of Transportation. I should emphasize and point out that legal sufficiency reviews are only a small part of what our government contracts attorneys do. Among other things, our government contract attorneys litigate bid protests or contract protests and appeals before the Contract Appeals Board. They review solicitations, not simply contracts, but solicitations for contracts before they issue, to make sure that they are legally sufficient and comply with the law. They assist agencies with contract administration issues. They review all contracts that come out of our office, the Office of Attorney General. Those are simply some of the things that our government contracts attorneys do. So legal sufficiency review of the contracts that we do review as a matter of practice is only a piece of it.
Thank you. So you're not going to get back to me on that, since you just gave me the numbers.
Yes, I got back to you on that already. Thank you.
14. Ms. Hageman, so how does your office ensure that there is legal sufficiency on contracts? Because there ought to be legal, attorneys should be looking at every contract or the government is committed.
Well, what we have, in addition to the ability to go to OAG whenever we feel that we want to go to them, and we do have people that go regularly to the procurement sector or government contract section of OAG with questions, especially for those that we think are going to have litigation implications or complicated legal issues. But we also have in-house our general counsel's office, which provides a lot of support to the procurement staff, especially for those contracts that are not going to OAG. And that group is there to provide assistance in negotiating terms of the contract, to review clauses, review proposals that are not consistent with the solicitation, and provide all kinds of advice. So we have that in-house general counsel capability.
I can never remember the difference between a contracting officer, contracting specialist. Who would have handled this contract? A specialist officer?
Well, it would definitely have a contracting officer, because that's the person who has the authority to bind the district government and sign the contract. The contract specialist supports the contracting officer, may assist in following up on getting the documents, like requesting an updated clean hands, or even drafting some of the documents. So the contract specialist supports the contracting officer.
And how many contracting officers do you have?
I think we might have about 45 around that.
And how many specialists?
Well, these are just rough numbers, but I would say on specialists, we may have about 100.
Is it enough for the work?
Well, in some cases, no. And I think what we're experiencing now, when I say I may have talked about 100 slots, what we're experiencing now, same thing as any district agency, I think right now, is we're experiencing a lot of people coming and going in OCP as they seek new job opportunities or different job opportunities after the pandemic. And so these are funded positions, but yet we have a fair amount of turnover.
So my takeaway here is, let me see if I can get this right. It may be that the procurement couldn't have started sooner than it did. However, because it started when it did, it was going to have to come to the council as a retroactive contract. It could have come to the council in September. All the documentation was pretty much in place, but not enough folks at OCP for the workload at the time, so it gets deprioritized. And then it gets put off and put off. And the result is that more work needs to be done, just simply to update clean hands and update certificates of insurance and review what hasn't been done and review it some more. And finally, because I'm thinking February, could have come to us in February, but it's not until March that it goes to OAG for legal sufficiency. OAG turns it around in a month. There's some communications back and forth. OAG could use maybe a few more attorneys, but it's not clear to me that a month, when we're talking about 11-month delay, was the problem here. But then it goes to IQ. I'm not allowed to say it goes to OPLA, it goes to IQ. And OPLA does not honcho it along, so it gets stalled on LP's desk for 5 weeks and then comes to us too late for the recess. That's kind of my takeaway on this. Have any other questions? I think the only other question that comes to mind, and it's really for none of you at the table except Mr. Wells, is are we going to see this again with the food service contracts for DCPS?
Which contracts with DCPS?
The food service contracts. So the food service contracts we were promised, you may have seen my letter to the chancellor in June. Why was I told month after month after month after month that they were going to be here in time for the council to approve them before the start of the contract period, which is July 1st. We still don't have the contracts. This is for food service. Mr. Wells, you were a member of the council, I believe, when some very controversial food service contracts were here. Council members objected to them, but we don't even have the contracts, and the contract period's already started. I think DCPS, which has shown that its contracting process is really quite messed up and it's independent of OCP. I'll just note that. So are we going to see lots of delays and retroactivity and problems with the food service contracts, Mr. Wells?
I can't speak to that. What I can say is that, you know, I know that you're working closely with the chancellor and that you meet with the chancellor and that I'm sure this conversation has come up between y'all about food services for DCPS. And I believe that you have the person, you know, in front of you when you have those meetings to help answer that question. But in terms of OPLA doing its part, of course we will. And we understand the urgency of, and so does the mayor in meeting the criteria of the law.
Are you all going to take back, and you all means really you, Mr. Wells and Ms. Haitman, going to take back to your, I guess, your office after this hearing, looking at this process and ways to avoid this reevaluating the internal processes so that the retroactivity is much less or avoided altogether, Ms. Haitman?
Mr. Chair, as I spoke to you a few months ago to alert you, one of the first things I did when I took this job is to tell you that there were a number of contracts that were retroactive, and it came about from 2 contracts that you were, pulling the thread on. And so I came to you very early on to give you a heads up that this was a problem taken seriously by the Executive Office of the Mayor and the Mayor herself. And we are committed to meeting the law. And as you stated in the Home Rule Charter, that these contracts are to come through for council approval. And so am I guaranteeing you that as of today, each one will meet the law? I can only guarantee you that this is, that we're going to take, and we are taking all measures to be sure, with the staffing that we have, with the resources we have, to meet the mandates of the law. But I've kept you, and I believe the Chancellor now has kept you informed most steps along the way of where these contracts are.
So, Ms. Haitman, are you going to take back from this hearing, looking at processes to see if we can speed things up?
I would say yes, but I'd also say it's something we're looking at it. We really have in the last few months focused on this, and we will continue to focus. And I think this hearing reemphasizes that message.
When the PARB met on this contract, was it discussed at all that this could have come to us in September, but it was deprioritized due to workload?
At the PARB, it did come up with contracts that we did have a prioritization issue. I know it came up at the PARB. I can't say that it was this particular contract, but I know that the PARB did discuss prioritization of workload and how that had an impact on some of the contracts.
But this contract was discussed
This contract absolutely was on the agenda of the PARB
and discussed.
and discussed.
But whether the prioritization of this contract, that may not have been specifically discussed, but prioritization was discussed generally,
Correct,
and therefore workload issues.
correct.
And Mr. Wells, is your office going to reevaluate the internal processes to move these more quickly?
Well, as I said, OPLA submitted these exactly when we were supposed to submit them. But in terms of being sure that there is a tickler system that is in place now, it's one of the reforms and things that I've brought to when I got there, to see that some things were not moving efficiently through. So we now provide a report and working closely with especially the Chief of Staff's office to make sure that things move quickly. I get just as frustrated with bureaucracy, and now that I'm in it, even more so.
Are you all aware of, and I think this means all of you, the Inspector General's Management Implication Report of July 25th concerning contracts in excess of $1 million? Ms. Haitman,
I am aware of it.
Dr. Grant, Mr. Rosenthal,
Yes.
and Mr. Wells?
I am now, yes.
Among other things, it says, I am sending MRI, that's Management Implication Report 23-R-002, to notify you of a significant issue regarding district agencies executing contracts in excess of $1 million without council approval, which may impact the district's fiscal year 2023 annual comprehensive financial report. So 3 of you are aware of it. Mr. Wells, do you want me to give you my copy?
Thank you. No, I have full access to that.
Okay. I don't have any other questions. If there's anything anyone wants to submit, the record's open for 2 weeks. Thank you, each of you. The time is 12:07 and this roundtable is adjourned.